The gospel today from Luke is called the Sermon on the Plain, or the Great Sermon in Luke. We are used to hearing the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew. There's some pretty significant differences between the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew and the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. One difference is that Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, the Beatitudes, the first 11 verses of Matthew, Beatitudes, there are more of them and they're longer. A second difference is that in Matthew, the Beatitudes say, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness." In Luke, the gospel is very simple. Jesus is very clear. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who hunger now. Blessed are those who mourn. And blessed are you when others hate you. And then another difference is that there are no woes added in Matthew, but there are 4 woes matching the 4 blessed are's, the 4 Beatitudes in Luke. Woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who are full. Woe to you who are happy. And woe to you when everyone speaks well of you. So those are very different, and they're very clear. In Matthew's gospel, we have what we could consider a spiritual hunger, a spiritual poverty, a spiritual suffering in some ways. In Luke, it's hungry, as in you want food. It's poor, as in you don't have any money. It's mournful, as in you are mourning and crying. And that is similar in Matthew. And this whole thing of blessed are you when people hate you. Matthew tells us that also, blessed are you when you're persecuted and all of that, but Luke just says, boom, blessed are you if people hate you. We do not like hearing these blessings and woes. We don't like hearing them at all because they're very different from what we like to think of who we are and how we are related to God. Because what these do is, blessed are you who are so poor you have nothing left but God. Blessed are you who are so hungry you have nothing left but God. Blessed are you who are so mournful that you have nothing left but God. And blessed are you when the people hate you, because then you have nothing left but God. So Jesus, another difference here is, obviously, the Sermon on the Mount is up on a mountaintop, and the Sermon on the Plain is down on what one commentator calls a level playing field, or Jesus is leveling with the disciples and the crowd. The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus starts out preaching. There's no precursor to that. He just is there. He's preaching, and all the people there are gathered. And his disciples are with him. Here in Luke, he comes down from the mountain with the disciples, who are already being called apostles in Luke. And he comes down to that level place, the plain, P-L-A-I-N, and there are a whole crowd of people already waiting for him. And they are from everywhere. They're from Tyre and Sidon. They're from Jerusalem. They're from all over the place. And they're waiting there because they want to hear him and they want to be healed. And what he does before he starts talking is he heals everybody. And he's being crushed around by everyone who wants to touch him. But but we don't hear a frustration with that. He just takes care of everybody. And then what Luke's gospel says is he casts his eyes on the disciples. He looks at those followers of him. He's essentially saying to them, I see you, and I want you to see me. I see you, I hear you. I want you to see me and hear me. Now, the crowds around him are also going to hear what he has to say, but he very clearly aims it at his disciples, and he casts his eye on them, which is like the eye of God watching. It's like when you make eye contact with somebody, they have to acknowledge you, right? When I used to teach school, and I would be calling on somebody, or I'd be asking for somebody to volunteer for something, and they'd just sit there, then I would go and find a way to make eye contact, and then they'd have to pay attention. Jesus is making sure his disciples are really listening to him. And then he's saying something to them that they really don't want to hear. They come from a society, and we do too, in which wealth equals power, equals, for many people, God's favor. And Jesus is telling them the opposite of that. He's telling us the opposite of that. He's asking his disciples, or saying to his disciples and saying to us, can you rely entirely on God? And almost all of us would say we're not very good at that. My father used to tell me that when I was trying to put something together or do something, he'd say, when all else fails, Tamsen reads the directions. Because I liked to figure things out for myself. And you could translate that to, when all else fails, we start praying. Because we like to take care of what we think we need to do ourselves. And what Jesus is saying is you start there with a prayer. You start with an awareness that we rely entirely on God. And we like to say, you know, God helps those who help themselves. We like to say, well, that's a good way. Well, yes, that's true. However, God helps us because we turn to God first, and the thing is that God is always there. So while we're busy saying, okay, I've got power, I've got wealth, I'm in charge, I can do what I want, God is there saying, you have that power and that wealth and those abilities to help other people, not to turn them away, not to send them, well, just not to turn them away. And what Jesus gives us the example of that, he comes down the mountain, and there are all these people who need impossible things, and yet he heals them. And he does all of that before he even gives his Sermon on the Plain. He does that before he starts the Beatitudes and the woes, because he's demonstrating what it is to rely on God and to do God's will. Imagine you noticed in the first lesson that there were blessings and woes for the people in Jeremiah, and they're very similar to what Jesus is saying. If you remember the Magnificat, Mary's song, the reversal is very similar, and that's in Luke. You know, the lowly are raised up, and I'm not going to get the right word, the satisfied are sent away empty. All of those things are consistent in Luke with our understanding that God is God and we're not, and that we are called to do and challenged by God in Jesus Christ to do and be people that are not comfortable doing and being who we're called to be. We really like to take care of ourselves first, and Jesus demonstrates not that we shouldn't take care of ourselves, but we don't only take care of ourselves, and we don't necessarily do that first. Those of you who are parents, or those of you who travel on airplanes, do you remember whenever they say on an airplane, you know, the oxygen mask is going to come down, put it on yourself first and then take care of other people? That's a situation where you can't take care of other people unless you take care of yourself first. But in most situations, like if you're a parent and you're dealing with children, you're going to take care of them first and then worry about yourself. If you're going to deal with an elderly parent, you're going to take care of that elderly parent first and then take care of yourself. And that's really the way that Jesus demonstrates to us what we need to do, not on airplanes, but elsewhere. Yesterday, several of us went to a program at the diocesan program about Absalom Jones at Grace Kirkwood. And Absalom Jones, who knows who he is? Okay, Carolyn and John, what do you want to say something?
First ordained black bishop, priest at the Episcopal Church.
First ordained priest, black priest in the Episcopal Church. And you know about when that was?
1780s.
Yeah, 1790s, but you're very close. So thank you. And then, so he was ordained a deacon in the 1790s. He was ordained a priest in the early 1800s. He's the first black priest in the Episcopal Church. He was born he was enslaved in Delaware, and then he was sold to somebody in Philadelphia. And when he was in Delaware, he taught himself to read using the New Testament. And he memorized the New Testament. Exactly how he taught himself to read, I'm not sure, but he did. And then he pursued as much education as he could. And when he got to Philadelphia, the person to whom he was enslaved allowed him to go to night school for slaves. And he learned more and more and more. And then he bought his wife's freedom. And eventually he bought his own freedom. And after he had bought his own freedom, he and a person named Richard Allen started an organization called the Free African Society. And what that was like a social service agency to take care of people who were newly freed, and also to take care of people who were already free, but who happened to be of African descent and were struggling in Philadelphia. That group of people ended up being part of St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church. So it was a Methodist church, and they were there in that church, and that was fine until one day it wasn't fine. And the leaders in that congregation decided there were now too many black people in there, so they told them they had to move to the balcony. And so instead of moving to the balcony, they walked out as a group, and they already had the Free African Society going, and that became a place that was also for worship. And there, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen kind of parted ways in terms of worship and religious denomination. And Absalom Jones applied to the Episcopal Diocese of Pennsylvania, and they became a church and founded St. Thomas the Apostle Church, which still exists. And Richard Allen founded, anybody know what church? AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church. And they remained friends. And the other thing they did in Philadelphia is, besides continuing the work they were doing, was that there was an epidemic of yellow fever. And a whole bunch of people left the city, including most of the white clergy. They wanted to go off and be safe. They didn't want to catch yellow fever. So Absalom Jones and Richard Allen and the people of the Free African Society and a few other people took care of black and white people who were sick and dying, and they buried black and white people, which the rest of the city was afraid to do. So one of the things that I want us to hear about this is Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. And Absalom Jones, for us as Episcopalians in particular, just relied on God. He did what God told him to do. He prayed, and then he would listen. And even though it was a huge risk, I mean, he could have left the city of Philadelphia himself with his wife and his children. And instead, he stayed and buried people from whom he could have caught yellow fever. And he did that even though it was a huge risk, because he believed that was what God wanted him to do and the way in which he was to care for his fellow human beings, even if they didn't like him, even if they would have nothing to do with him on a normal basis, and even if he would rather have been somewhere else. That is what we are called to do, and it's not easy. We are called to think of other people first. We're called to talk to God, to have a conversation with God, to pray, and then act. And we're not going to necessarily be acting in our own, I don't want to say best interest, because I think we will be acting in our own best interests in the long run, but we aren't to act selfishly. We're not to drive people away just because we don't like them. We're not to say, I'm holding on to what I have because I've earned it, and you can't have it because you haven't earned it. Jesus is really specific here, and as I said, it's very hard for us to hear because most of us have what we need and more, and when we haven't had what we need, we have been able to acquire it one way or another. But I want us to remember, what are times when you have needed something and you haven't necessarily said so, but someone else saw that need and acted? What are times when you have heard another person speaking about another person at school, for example, or in your workplace, and have stood up for them or not? What are times when you risk yourself and your own comfort for the good of other people or the good of a larger group? The other thing for us to remember is Jesus is talking to all his disciples. He's looking all of them in the eye, and he's reminding them right then and there that they are a community. They are not in this by themselves, they're in it together. And we are not in the life of Christ by ourselves. We are in it together. That means that we can call each other to account, but it also means we have help. We have each other's prayers. We have help to do what we feel that we're called to do. And that is very, very important for all of us. At the same event yesterday, somebody came up to me, because I was greeting all kinds of people from all over the diocese that I hadn't seen in a long time. And somebody came up to me and said, "Gosh, everybody likes you." And I was thinking, oh, isn't that nice? But no, I don't want everyone to like me. Think of this gospel. You know? And I want us to remember that. We don't do things to be liked. We do things because they're right. We don't do things to secure our own selves without also providing security for others. Jesus is tough here in Luke, and we need to remember that we need to respond. Amen.